The night was as cold as a corpse's embrace when I first caught wind of the Lundeen Johnson case. Minneapolis, usually a bustling metropolis, seemed to hold its breath as I, Cyrus Kade, freelance investigative reporter extraordinaire, delved into this decades-old mystery that had long since faded from the public eye. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in December when my editor, a gruff man with a penchant for cheap cigars and expensive scotch, tossed a yellowed file onto my desk. "Kade," he growled, "I've got a story that'll make your hair stand on end. The Lundeen Johnson murders, unsolved for 90 years. Think you can crack it?" I scoffed, adjusting my fedora. "Chief, I've tackled stories that would make your nightmares have nightmares. This is just another day at the office." Little did I know, as I leafed through the brittle pages of the case file, that I was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the darkness lurking in the human soul. The facts of the case were as stark as they were chilling. On April 11th, 1933, in the small town of Harris, Minnesota, a farmhouse went up in flames. When the smoke cleared and the embers cooled, authorities made a gruesome discovery: the charred remains of 29-year-old Alvira Lundeen Johnson and her 7 children. But this was no ordinary house fire. The coroner's report painted a picture so horrific it made my stomach churn. The victims were found in their sleeping positions, untouched by the flames that had consumed their home. It was as if death had visited them in their dreams, long before the fire ever started. As I pored over the details, a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a massacre. And the prime suspect? Alvin Johnson, Alvira's husband and father to those 7 innocent souls. Alvin Johnson, a man described as a giant at 6'3" and 240 pounds, had seemingly vanished into thin air. The authorities had launched a manhunt that stretched from the forests of Minnesota to the vast expanse of Canada, where Johnson had once worked in logging camps. But as I dug deeper, I realized that this case was far from simple. The Depression era was a time of desperation and darkness. Men disappeared all the time, riding the rails in search of work or fleeing debts they couldn't pay. Could Alvin Johnson have been just another lost soul, wrongly accused of an unthinkable crime? I knew I had to find out, and so, armed with nothing but my wits, my trusty notepad, and a healthy dose of skepticism, I set out to unravel the mystery that had haunted Harris, Minnesota for nearly a century. My first stop was the Chisago County Historical Society. As I pushed open the creaky door, the musty smell of old books and forgotten memories assaulted my nostrils. Behind the counter sat a wizened old woman, her eyes magnified to comical proportions by thick glasses. "I'm looking for information on the Lundeen Johnson murders," I said, flashing my press badge. The old woman's eyes widened even further, if that was possible. "Oh my," she whispered. "No one's asked about that case in years. Are you sure you want to go digging up those old bones, young man?" I nodded grimly. "Sometimes, ma'am, the only way to lay ghosts to rest is to drag them into the light." She disappeared into a back room, returning moments later with a dusty box. As I began to sift through the contents, I felt a presence behind me. Turning, I found myself face to face with a tall, gaunt man in a sheriff's uniform. "You, the reporter, asking questions about the Johnson case?" he drawled. I stood, extending my hand. "Cyrus Kade, and you are?" "Sheriff Tom Larson. My grandfather was on the force when it happened. Word of advice, Mr. Kade, some stories are better left untold." As he turned to leave, I called after him. "And some truths demand to be heard, Sheriff, no matter how uncomfortable they might be." He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Without turning back, he spoke softly. "Be careful, Mr. Kade. This town has secrets it doesn't like disturbed." With that ominous warning ringing in my ears, I turned back to the box of evidence. Little did I know, I was about to embark on a journey that would take me to the very heart of darkness. As I delved deeper into the case, the lines between past and present began to blur. I found myself walking the same streets that Alvin Johnson had walked, breathing the same air that had once filled the lungs of Alvira and her children. I interviewed old-timers who remembered the night of the fire, their eyes growing distant as they recounted the horror of that April morning. One elderly woman, her hands shaking as she poured me a cup of coffee, leaned in close. "They say," she whispered, her voice quavering, That on quiet nights, you can still hear the children crying from the ruins of the old Johnson place. I suppressed a shudder. And what do you say, ma'am? She fixed me with a steely gaze. I say that evil leaves a mark, Mr. Kade, and some marks never fade. As I left her house, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of childish laughter. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was just the wind in the trees. But deep down, I knew better. My investigation led me to the county records office, where I unearthed a startling piece of information. Just days before the fire, Alvira Johnson's father had evicted the family from the farmhouse. The plot thickened. Was this a case of a man pushed to the brink, lashing out at those he should have protected? But as I dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Witness statements from the night of the fire mentioned tire tracks leading away from the house, quickly obliterated by the arrival of other vehicles. Could Alvira Johnson have fled the scene, leaving his family to burn? Or was there something more sinister at play? As the days turned into weeks, I found myself consumed by the case. I barely ate, hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of those 7 children, their eyes wide with terror as death came for them in the night. It was during one of these fitful nights that the breakthrough came. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. The kerosene can. In the 1960s, a kerosene can had been found in the sheriff's office, reportedly obtained from the Johnson farm after the fire. With trembling hands, I dialed the current sheriff's number. "Sheriff Larson," I said when he answered, my voice hoarse with lack of sleep. "I need to see that kerosene can." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Kade," the sheriff said slowly, "I think it's time we had a talk." The sheriff's office was dark when I arrived, save for a single lamp on Larson's desk. As I entered, he gestured for me to sit. "What I'm about to tell you," he began, his voice low, "has been passed down through generations of lawmen in this county. It's a secret we've guarded for 90 years. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "I'm listening." Larson took a deep breath. "Alvira Johnson didn't kill his family, Mr. Kade. He died trying to save them." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "But the manhunt, the indictment." "All a cover-up," Larson said grimly. "The truth was too horrible, too unbelievable. They thought it was better to let people believe it was just another tragic murder-suicide." "What was the truth?" I whispered, though part of me didn't want to know. Larson's eyes met mine, and in them, I saw a fear that chilled me to my very core. The night of the fire, Alvira Johnson encountered something in that farmhouse, something not of this world. When the first responders arrived, they found him, or what was left of him, in the children's room. He'd used his own body as a shield, trying to protect them from whatever it was. I felt the blood drain from my face. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" "I'm saying, Mr. Kade, that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike. And sometimes, those things wear the faces of the ones we love most." As if on cue, the lights in the office flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. In the silence that followed, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the soft, playful laughter of children. My heart raced as I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. Sheriff Larson's face was a mask of terror, his eyes wide and unfocused. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of my own ragged breathing. Before I could ask who they were, a gust of icy wind swept through the office, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging us back into inky blackness. The laughter grew louder, closer, and I felt something brush against my leg. Something small, with the cold, clammy touch of death. "Sheriff!" I called out, my voice cracking with fear. "We need to get out of here." But there was no response. Instead, I heard a strangled gasp, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Panic seized me as I scrambled for the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp the handle. As I wrenched it open, letting in a shaft of moonlight from the hallway, I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of my days. Sheriff Larson lay on the floor, his eyes wide and glassy, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. And standing over him, their faces twisted into grotesque parodies of childish glee, were 7 small figures. Their skin was blackened and charred, their clothes tattered and singed, but their eyes, Their eyes glowed with an unholy light that spoke of an hunger unquenched for 9 decades. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, my feet barely touching the ground as I fled the sheriff's office, the town, the whole cursed county. But even as I put miles between myself and Harris, Minnesota, I couldn't escape the sound of that childish laughter or the memory of those glowing eyes. It's been weeks since that night, and I haven't slept more than an hour at a time. Every time I close my eyes, I see those charred faces, hear that terrible laughter. I've tried to tell myself it was all a hallucination, a product of too many sleepless nights and too much coffee. But deep down, I know the truth. The Lundeen Johnson case wasn't just an unsolved murder. It was something far more sinister, a glimpse into a world of horrors beyond human comprehension. Alvira Johnson didn't kill his family. He died trying to save them from something that defies explanation, something that still walks the earth, wearing the faces of innocent children. As I sit here, typing out this report with trembling fingers, I can't help but wonder, have I unleashed something by digging up this long-buried secret? Will those charred figures come for me next, their laughter echoing through the night as they seek to claim another victim? I don't know, but I do know this. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some truths are too terrible to face, and sometimes the most horrifying monsters are the ones we create in our desperate attempts to explain the unexplainable. So if you're ever driving through Harris, Minnesota on a dark night, and you see a farmhouse that isn't there in the daylight, or hear the laughter of children where no children should be, don't stop. Don't investigate. Just drive as fast and as far as you can, because some stories don't have endings. Some horrors never truly die, and sometimes the price of knowledge is far too high to pay. This is Cyrus Kade, signing off, and if you're listening to this, consider it my final warning. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some secrets should stay buried, and some fires never really go out. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I found myself unable to shake off the horrors I had witnessed in Harris, Minnesota. The Lundeen Johnson case had become more than just another story. It had become an obsession, a dark cloud that hung over every waking moment. I tried to move on, to take on new assignments, but everything paled in comparison to the terror I had experienced that night in the sheriff's office. My editor, concerned about my increasingly erratic behavior, suggested I take some time off. But how could I explain to him that sleep had become my enemy? That every time I closed my eyes, I saw those charred faces, heard that chilling laughter? It was during one of these sleepless nights that I received a call. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, elderly, quavering with fear. "Mr. Kade," the voice said, "my name is Alvira Lundeen. I think I might be the last living relative of Alvira Lundeen Johnson." My heart nearly stopped. "Mrs. Lundeen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "what can you tell me about your family?" There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of labored breathing. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to know, Mr. Kade. Something that's been kept secret for generations. Can you come to see me?" I should have said no. Every instinct screamed at me to hang up the phone, to walk away from this cursed case once and for all. But the reporter in me, the part that had always pushed for the truth no matter the cost, wouldn't let me. "Where are you, Mrs. Lundeen?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. "I'm in a nursing home in St. Paul," she replied. "Please hurry, Mr. Kade. I don't think I have much time left." The St. Paul Sunset Nursing Home was a grim, brutalist structure that seemed to suck the very life out of the air around it. As I walked down the sterile hallways, the smell of disinfectant and decay assaulting my nostrils, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. Room 237. I knocked softly, then entered. Alvira Lundeen was a tiny woman, her body barely making a dent in the hospital bed. But her eyes, when they fixed on me, were sharp and alert. "You're the reporter," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, taking a seat beside her bed. "Mrs. Lundeen, you said you had information about the Johnson family murders?" She closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "What I'm about to tell you, Mr. Kade, has been a burden on my family for 90 years. A secret so terrible, so unbelievable that it's driven some of us to madness." I leaned in closer, my heart pounding. I'm listening, Mrs. Lundeen. Alvira, she wasn't just my relative, she was my aunt, and the night of the fire, I was there. I felt my blood run cold. But that's impossible, you would have been. A child, she finished for me. Yes, I was staying with them that night. I should have died with the others, but I didn't. Because what happened that night, it wasn't murder, Mr. Kade. It was something far worse. As Eleanor began to speak, her voice growing stronger with each word, I felt the world around me start to spin. The story she told was one of ancient evils, of a curse that had followed the Lundeen family for generations, of a night when the veil between worlds had thinned and something unspeakable had crossed over. Albin, she said, her eyes filling with tears, he tried to save us. He fought against it with everything he had. But in the end, it was too strong. It took them all, Alvira, the children, even Albin himself, and it would have taken me too if, she trailed off, her gaze becoming unfocused. Mrs. Lundeen? I prompted gently, leaning closer. If what? Her eyes snapped back to mine, filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. If I hadn't made a deal, she whispered. A chill ran down my spine. What kind of deal? Eleanor's gnarled hands clutched at the bedsheets. A deal with the darkness, Mr. Kade. A promise to keep it secret, to let the world believe the lie about Albin. In exchange, it let me live. I felt my mouth go dry. But why are you telling me this now? A single tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. Because I'm dying, Mr. Kade. And I fear that when I go, there will be nothing to hold it back anymore. As if on cue, the lights in the room flickered ominously. Eleanor's eyes widened in panic. You need to go, she gasped. It's coming. It knows I've broken my promise. I stood, my chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. Mrs. Lundeen, we need to get you out of here. But she shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. It's too late for me, Mr. Kade, but you can still save yourself. Run and never look back. The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. In the shadows, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, the soft, playful laughter of children. Go, Eleanor screamed, her voice filled with terror. Go now. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached for the handle, I heard Eleanor let out a blood-curdling scream. Then silence. I ran through the darkened hallways of the nursing home, the sound of childish laughter echoing behind me. Nurses and orderlies called out in confusion, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. It wasn't until I was in my car, speeding away from St. Paul, that I allowed myself to breathe. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. That somehow, by learning the truth, I had become part of the story. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and sleepless nights. I tried to write up my findings to make sense of what Eleanor had told me, but the words wouldn't come. Every time I sat down at my typewriter, I felt a presence behind me, heard the faint echo of laughter. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, shadowy figures that disappeared when I turned to look. More than once, I woke up in the middle of the night to find my apartment filled with the acrid smell of smoke. My editor, concerned about my increasingly erratic behavior, suggested I take a leave of absence. But how could I explain to him that I was being haunted by the ghosts of a 90-year-old murder? That every time I closed my eyes, I saw charred faces and glowing eyes? It was during one of these sleepless nights that I made a decision. I had to go back to Harris. I had to see the site of the Johnson farm for myself. Maybe then, I could find some closure, some way to end this nightmare. The drive to Harris was long and tense. Every mile marker seemed to whisper warnings, every road sign a portent of doom. As I crossed the county line, a heavy fog rolled in, reducing visibility to mere feet. I found myself on a lonely dirt road, the headlights of my car barely penetrating the thick mist. According to my research, this was where the Johnson farm had stood. But as I peered through the fog, I saw something impossible. A farmhouse, intact and glowing with warm light. My rational mind screamed at me to turn back, to flee while I still could. But something drew me forward, an inexorable pull that I was powerless to resist. As I stepped out of the car, the fog seemed to part, revealing a scene that couldn't possibly exist. The farmhouse stood before me, looking exactly as it must have on that fateful night in 1933. And on the porch, illuminated by the warm glow from within, stood a family, A tall, broad-shouldered man, a woman, and 7 children. They turned to look at me, their faces friendly and welcoming. But as I watched in horror, their skin began to blacken and char, their eyes taking on that unholy glow I remembered from the sheriff's office. The man, Alvira Johnson, I realized with a jolt of terror, spoke, his voice a horrifying rasp. "Welcome home, Mr. Kade. We've been waiting for you." I tried to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. As the charred figures descended the porch steps, their laughter echoing in the night, I realized the terrible truth. I hadn't been investigating the Lundeen Johnson murders. I had been lured here, step by step, clue by clue. And now, 90 years later, the family was complete again. As the charred hands reached for me, I had one last terrifying thought. Sometimes the story finds you, and sometimes it never lets you go. I don't know how long I've been here, in this farmhouse that exists outside of time and space. Days, weeks, years, they all blur together in an endless nightmare of fire and laughter. I write this now as a warning, a desperate attempt to reach out to anyone who might be tempted to follow in my footsteps. The Lundeen Johnson case is more than just an unsolved mystery. It's a trap, a lure for the curious and the brave. If you're reading this, if you've somehow found these words scrawled in ash and blood, heed my warning. Let the past stay buried. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. Some stories are better left untold. For in the quiet town of Harris, Minnesota, there's a farmhouse that appears only in the deepest fog on the darkest nights. And inside, a family waits, forever frozen in their final moments, always looking for new members to join their eternal vigil. This is Cyrus Kade, signing off for the last time. Remember my words, and for your own sake, stay away from Harris, because once you're part of the story, there's no escape. The fire never goes out, the laughter never stops, and the night never ends. Epilogue. The cycle continues. Months after Cyrus Kade's disappearance, a young reporter named Lila Chen sits at her desk, sifting through old case files. Her eyes light up as she comes across a dusty folder labeled Lundeen Johnson Murders, 1933. As she begins to read, a chill runs down her spine. In the background, almost too faint to hear, the sound of children's laughter echoes through the empty office. The cycle begins anew, the story seeking out its next victim. For in Harris, Minnesota, the past is never truly gone, and some stories never end.
Thanks for joining us in the shadows tonight. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories every week. Have you got a story of your own? Share it in the comments below. We love hearing from you. And remember, the darkness holds many secrets. Are you brave enough to uncover them? Until next time, keep your lights on and your doors locked. Sweet nightmares.